it is divided into two categories. One is called darura and one is called haja. And these are related to another concept which is in al-maqasid al-sharia, al-daruriyat, al-hajiyat, al-tahsiniyat. People have needs, and these needs are at certain levels of intensity. And the sharia, the lawgiver, has, in making so many of the laws, taken into account preservation of people's essential needs in this life. And some have identified them as 5, some have added as 6. There are different breakdowns on how many of these issues are essential needs. But there are 6 which are really fundamental that most would agree upon. One is the religion. People's religious need is to have a connection with their Creator. So there are so many laws or provisions of the Sharia which are there to foster and protect this aspect of life. And another major one is life itself, promoting and preserving life. These are major aspects of considerations behind Sharia legislation. Promoting and preserving people's lineage or progeny, that their children know who they're related to. And sometimes some people substitute in place of that honor or dignity. They're two separate issues, and both of them are manifestly important. As we mentioned in an earlier episode, human dignity is one of those basic God-given rights. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We have honored the children of Adam. And also, you have the intellect. This is one of the key major themes of the Sharia. Most people think of it in terms simply of, oh yeah, it's haram to drink alcohol because it impairs the intellect. But there's also the other aspect of it, which is cultivating the intellect. The Qur'an is full of verses telling us to look at this, consider that, examine this, travel in the earth and look and see. And so all of those are things which are supposed to spur us to be curious about the world around us and to investigate it with our minds. So developing the mind is really important, along with just preserving it from intoxication. It has to also be developed. And also wealth, preserving people's right to their wealth, encouraging the production of wealth. All of these are aspects of major needs that the Sharia recognizes. And some of them are, the fulfillment of these needs in certain ways is at a level where if it's not fulfilled, then life just gets totally disrupted and there's widespread misery. And, if it's on a societal level, and if it's on an individual level, life becomes almost intolerable, hard, difficult to bear. And there is a level where if the need is not met, it creates great inconvenience, but, life can carry on, but with impairment. And then this third level of tahsiniyat is things which are good. They make life more pleasant, more beneficial, but if you weren't able to get them, or if they were not realized, then the main course of life will still function. So with regard to difficulty and hardship and the kind of difficulties that the Sharia makes a cause for facility, this facility relates to the relaxation of rules that are normally strict. And strict rules are of two types. There are commands to do things, which are wajibat, and there are prohibitions, don't do certain things, which are what is called haram, mahdur. So facility comes in either reducing an obligation or in allowing something which is normally prohibited. And these are due to unusual circumstances. So these include travel. We know that when you're traveling, there are certain rules which become relaxed. When you're sick, there are rules which become relaxed. When you are forced to do something against your will, okay, the same kind of judgment doesn't apply to a person in that situation. A person who forgets, okay, that's different from a person who doesn't do something while being fully aware that they're supposed to be doing it. A person who's unaware of the ruling. Now, for all of these, there are parameters to how they apply to the relaxation of rules. If a person says, well, I didn't know that it's haram to commit fornication, if you're a Muslim and you grew up in a Muslim country and you're an adult and you say, I didn't know that zina is haram, that kind of excuse is, that ignorance is, there's no excuse for it before the law. Conceivably, a person may, the classical example is a person who grew up in the desert. I remember I met a man who was a Bedouin from Qatar. And he said, we used to not take ghusl after intercourse because we didn't know that you're supposed to do it. And then somebody came to us and informed us. So, the classical example of that was a Bedouin growing up in the desert and just not having access to knowledge. Another prominent example of that is a Muslim who grows up in a non-Muslim environment. And so, again, they're cut off from access to Islamic knowledge. Another example of a cause for facility, a kind of a hardship, is widespread affliction. Something that affects everybody and you just can't get away from it. It's very difficult to avoid it in a certain time and place. When something reaches that level, then the demand to avoid it becomes less stringent. It's umum al-balwa in Arabic. And another aspect that brings relaxation is deficiency. So a classical example of that is a child breaks a window. He's not, legally liable for that. His parents would have to pay for the damage that the child caused, but from a Sharia point of view, that child is still not legally responsible for his actions. So these are aspects of various kinds of factors that trigger relaxation. With regard to hardship, you also have to examine that. There are some kinds of hardship that accompany acts of worship no matter what. There's a certain amount of effort required to get up, and you're asleep, it's Fajr time. There's a certain amount of hardship required and effort required to get up, get out of your bed, make wudu, and walk to the mosque. The mosque is walking distance. You're supposed to bear with that kind of hardship. That's not considered hardship that triggers relaxation of the normal rule. Making wudu when the water is chilly, maybe it's a little bit uncomfortable, or when the water is very hot, maybe it's a little uncomfortable, but you put up with that because it's not something that's ever going to be eliminated with regard to these acts of worship. And that hardship that you're dealing with is good for you from a training point of view. One of the aspects of ibadah is to develop you as a person. So being steadfast and patient are qualities that Allah likes. We'll pick up after the break, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
If I were to ask you about the life of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, about the incidents that occurred before his prophethood and in Mecca and in Medina, about the names of his loved ones and his wives and his children, how much would we be able to know? How many incidents have we memorized? Brothers and sisters, isn't it more important that we study the seerah of the most important human being who ever walked the face of this earth? Join me, your host Yasir Qadhi, as we discuss the most important biography of the most illustrious human being that ever lived, the seerah of our beloved Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Join Yasir Qadhi in Seerah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, every Saturday at 6 p.m. UK and 7 p.m. Europe on Peace TV.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back. We talked about the hardship that's always there with acts of worship. There are some kinds of hardship which are not always there. And these can be broken down into three categories. There's a kind of hardship that's really unbearable. Person has a splitting migraine headache. Making sajda in that situation causes unbearable pain. When the pain becomes unbearable, then that triggers relaxation. So there are situations where a person may not be able to make prostration all the way down to the ground. These are the kind of situations that normally a jurist decides it, but sometimes you're not in the presence of a jurist, and doing an action according to the normal way causes unbearable pain, then you have to use your common sense and adjust your actions so that you can bear to do the act of worship. There's other kinds of unusual hardship. They're not normally associated with an act of worship, and they're not very intense. You cut your finger, and it's like a paper cut. So making wudu, maybe it stings a little. You put your hand on the ground in sajda, and it's a little bit of discomfort. This kind of hardship is given no recognition by the Sharia. But, these kind of things are on a sliding scale. So there's a clear side of the spectrum where the hardship takes the ruling of triggering relaxation. And there's the other side of the spectrum where it's trivial, it's not important enough to cause relaxation. Okay, and then, there are points in between. So at some point, there's a category where, is this more like trivial hardship, or is it more like real serious hardship? So this requires, a jurist really to determine. And with regard to that, Al-Qarafi, he made an interesting observation that these kind of things should not just be left to, what does your average person think? Because your average person is not a reference for Sharia rulings. He said, if you're looking at some kind of a hardship that is occurring in a real case, and it's not specifically mentioned in a Sharia text, then you would look for something that's on the same level of hardship with it, for which some kind of consideration is given, and then if it's on a par with that, then it would conceivably be a cause for triggering relaxation. So the example he gave was lice. When a person is in ihram, they're allowed to shave their head if they're troubled by lice. And so if something is on that same level of discomfort, then it could be considered as a trigger for relaxation for a related issue. Other issues related to the hardship is that it should be real, not anticipated. So if you think that something's going to happen in the future and that will cause you hardship, and therefore you don't do something today that you're obliged to do by the Sharia, then you've crossed a red line there. You've gone into a violation. And also, an important parameter for using this rule is that the relaxation cannot be at the expense of other people's rights. So, for instance, if a person was hungry and he was really, really hungry, he was starving, and he took somebody else's property and ate their food to survive, there's an opinion that al-idtirar la yubtilu haqq al-ghayr. That is a legal maxim in its own, which says that a severe need does not eliminate other people's rights. So if that person got back on his feet, then according to that maxim, he should reimburse the owner of that food for eating that food. Now, with regard to the effect that the way that relaxation takes place, sometimes an obligation is entirely dropped. So, for instance, a person who's blind, it's time to defend the land against invaders. He can't see. He's not legally required to go out and fight because he won't be of any benefit to the Muslim fighting force, and he has an excuse. Another way that obligation is affected is that it's reduced. So when you're a traveler, you normally have to pray 4 rakats for dhuhr, but because you're traveling, it becomes 2 rakats. One rule is substituted for another. You're sick, and making wudu would make you sicker. Therefore, you can make tayammum, which is dry ablution by striking dust with your hands and wiping your hands and face. Timing is shifted. For example, you're traveling in Ramadan and you break your fast. You're allowed to do that, but then you have to make up that day later. The format of an action is changed. For instance, a person is unable to stand due to illness. So in that case, the Sharia permits them to pray while sitting. And then those 5, they deal with obligations. And then with regard to the permission to do something that is normally prohibited, the case that is mentioned again and again in the Qur'an is starvation. It makes it permissible to eat foods that are normally prohibited. But there's also another issue, which is that there are certain transactions, and you see this most commonly in the field of transactions. There are certain transactions which, strictly speaking, they're anomalous and they don't quite fit in with the normal Sharia rules for how transactions should take place. Despite that, the Sharia has permitted them. Now, this is a different situation from the one just mentioned, because the Sharia, it has made these things, these certain kinds of transactions lawful for everybody, because there's a general need for them. So, a starving person eating pork, that only applies to that person in that situation. But using the permission for salam sales, which is like a forward contract, the person pays today for a good which will be delivered after 6 months or whatever, at a specific fixed date. So payment is today, and delivery is at a fixed later date. And that which is going to be delivered is specified, the quantity, the type, the amount, the weight, whatever. So this kind of a contract conflicts with the statement of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, don't sell that which you do not possess. So the person who's doing the selling there doesn't necessarily, and probably in most cases wouldn't, be possessing that good that he's promised to sell at the time that the contract is enacted. So the contract is anomalous, but there is a general need for it. And because there was a general need for it, the Prophet ﷺ permitted it. He found people doing it, and he permitted it, but he gave those rules to regulate it so that it doesn't become a cause for people falling into disputes. So that's some of the ways in which relaxation occurs. As far as the authority of the maxim, there's some that's extremely general. Quranic verses like, وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ. He imposed no hardship upon you in your religion. يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرَ. Allah wants ease for you, He doesn't want hardship. لَا يُكَلِّفُ اللَّهُ نَفْسًا إِلَّا وُسْعَهَا. Allah does not burden any soul more than it can bear. And then you have these very specific verses recurring with regard to the relaxation of the prohibition of certain kinds of foods. And then you also have a description of the Prophet ﷺ that he prohibits for them that which is foul, and he makes lawful for them that which is good, and he takes away from them, he lifts from them the burdens and the shackles that were upon them. So this lifting of the burden and removing of the shackles is again an indication that it's a primary goal of the legislation to make things easy for people. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ said. He said to his companions, يَسِّرُوا لَا تُعَسِّرُوا. Make things easy for people, don't make them difficult. So this principle is very, very well established in the Sharia. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
إلهي أنت ربي ذو الجلال علمت بما نويت بلا جدال إلهي قد أتيتك فاعف عني وهذا